There is a version of Lionel Messi that the cameras never found. The cameras show one Messi, but the real story, the one that truly defines him, played out in silence, not the one celebrated with trophies, nor the one who dances through defenses, not even the one who, years later, found solace in Doha. This is a different Messi. This version exists in a single room, in a single building, for a single hour, on the afternoon of July 13th, 2014. This version does not move, does not speak, does not perform. He sits with his elbows on his knees, his boots half-laced, staring at a point on the floor that holds no particular significance, except that it is somewhere to look that is not another man's eyes. Around him, the Maracanã hums like a living organism, 74,000 voices rehearsing their roars, even before the ball has been placed on the center spot. He knows this. He has always known this. It is the arithmetic of his life, since he was a boy too small for his own age group, and it has never once become easier to hold. And maybe that is the part of this story that is not really about him at all, because everyone, in their own way, has a room like this one. Everyone has a version of themselves. The cameras never find call to adventure. Above him, a nation, draped in blue and white, held its breath. Shops closed, families gathered, ready, in the quintessential Argentine way, to anoint him legend or cast him out by nightfall. This is not a story about a football match. Germany's system, their pressing triangles, their discipline in transition, all of that will matter in 90 minutes. But it does not matter now. This is a story about the 40 minutes before it, the ones that no broadcast captured because there was nothing to broadcast. A man becoming quiet in the specific way that only the loudest expectations can produce. For Messi, silence wasn't emptiness. It was a shield, forged in years of relentless scrutiny. What was he thinking about in that locker room? Outside this room, an entire nation holds its breath, not just for a game, but for a verdict on its greatest son. Tonight, he either becomes a legend or a ghost. That is the call he must answer. Not just his career, but his worth in the eyes of a country that had already decided long before kickoff exactly what he owed them. To understand the silence, you first have to understand everything that built it. Refusal of the call, Lionel Messi. A love for Argentina, always earned, never freely given. This is the part of the story that gets flattened in the highlight reels, smoothed into a simple narrative of genius and adoration. The truth is messier and colder. This wasn't just about football. It was a country's complicated, often harsh love for a son who felt, to them, not quite their own. This was the first hurdle, a battle fought before any whistle blew. For most of his career, large parts of his own country regarded him with a suspicion that bordered on resentment, not because he lacked ability, but because he lacked resemblance. He had left Rosario at 13. His body was failing to produce the growth hormone that would allow him to become an athlete without medical intervention, and Argentina's own football federation had shown no interest in paying for the treatment. Barcelona, however, had. So he grew up, quite literally, in Catalan soil, his Spanish accent softened by Catalan vowels, his formative football education entirely European, his loyalty forged somewhere far from the dust of Argentine pitches, where legends like Diego Maradona had been built from the ground up, visibly, publicly, in full view of the people who would later worship them. Maradona himself never fully forgave Messi for this absence, not maliciously, but there was, in his public comments over the years, an undertone of a man measuring another man against a myth that had been built through suffering the crowd could witness firsthand. Messi had suffered too, but his suffering had happened in a Barcelona academy dormitory. In daily injections, a small boy learned to give himself in a homesickness that had no audience. That kind of pain doesn't translate into folklore. It doesn't get sung about in the terraces. It stays private, and privacy in Argentina can look indistinguishable from distance. So when he wore the Alba Celeste, he was always, in some sense, proving a citizenship that should never have needed proving. Every miss was interpreted not as misfortune, but as evidence. Every crucial pass that didn't find its man became another entry in the ledger of a country's collective doubt. Maybe he really does belong more to them than to us. By 2014, that ledger had grown heavy. 3 years earlier, in 2011, Messi had already lost a Copa America final on home soil, dismissed early by Uruguay, walking off the pitch in Santa Fe to whistles from his own supporters. Whistles aimed not at the result, but at him personally, at the way his class on the ball had not, in their eyes, translated into the kind of visible, bleeding effort that Argentine football culture demanded as proof of love. He had watched teammates embrace afterward while he stood apart, unsure whether his presence would be comfort or intrusion. He had given interviews in those years with the particular flatness of a man who had learned that showing hurt only invited more of it. There is a particular cruelty reserved for the greatest talent of a generation who plays for a country that has already had its genius decades earlier and has decided that greatness must look like Diego: expressive, combustible, dangerous, entirely of the street. Messi's genius was quieter. It lived in economy of movement, in the extra half-second of vision that let him see a pass before the gap existed. His genius wasn't for grand tales, but for ruthless efficiency, a brilliance Argentina, for too long, struggled to embrace. By the time the 2014 World Cup arrived in Brazil, something had begun to shift, but only barely. He had scored in the opening game against Bosnia and Herzegovina, then produced a moment of individual brilliance against Iran in the dying minutes of a match Argentina was about to draw, a curling strike from the edge of the box that turned a nation's frustration into relief in a single touch. He scored twice against Nigeria. He was, statistically and visibly, dragging a team that was not yet at its best through the tournament on his own back. The way a man carries a piece of furniture that is slightly too heavy, not gracefully, but doggedly, refusing to put it down in front of witnesses. And still, the whispers followed him into Brazil. The true opponents weren't just on the field. They were in the headlines, in the murmurs of doubt, demanding a performance that was not just about winning, but about proving his very right to belong. Still, there were pundits, Argentine and foreign alike, who framed every Argentina match as an audition, a referendum on whether Messi could finally do what Maradona had done in 1986, carry a team to the trophy essentially alone, and in doing so, earn a form of national forgiveness for the sin of having grown up somewhere else. He was 27 years old. He had already won 3 Ballon d'Ors. He had already broken records that would take decades to approach, and still, in the eyes of a significant portion of the country he represented, he had not yet won the one thing that mattered: their unconditional love. A World Cup, they believed, would buy it. Nothing else would. This is the weight. He walked into the Maracanã dressing room carrying, on the afternoon of July 13th. There is another layer to this weight, one rarely discussed with the seriousness it deserves, the burden of translation. Messi had spent more than half his life speaking two footballing languages simultaneously: the Barcelona dialect of patient possession, of triangles and third-man runs, learned at La Masia from the age of 13, and the Argentine dialect, older and rawer, built on individual improvisation, on a single man's capacity to conjure something from nothing in a crowded box. His genius had been shaped almost entirely by the former. His national team was still, in many ways, asking him to speak in the latter, to be Diego, when the system around him more closely resembled Guardiola's Barcelona than the chaotic, brilliant sides Maradona had inherited in the 80s. There was also the matter of his body. By the age of 27, Messi had already absorbed nearly a decade and a half of professional football, much of it played through minor injuries he rarely spoke of publicly: a torn hamstring the year before, a series of muscular complaints that had shortened his pre-tournament preparation, the kind of accumulated physical wear that never appears in a highlight reel but sits, quietly, in the muscles of a man asked to sprint past defenders built like doors. He had trained through discomfort for most of that World Cup, telling almost no one outside the medical staff the true extent of it, because to admit physical vulnerability in that moment would have handed his critics one more line of argument: that he wasn't tough enough, wasn't built of the same unbreakable material as the players Argentina had mythologized before him. So he carried all of it into that dressing room. The inherited myth he could never fully embody, the tactical translation only he seemed to fully understand, the physical toll he had told no one about, and above all, the accumulated weight of a country's conditional love. Kiestelin, a love that had never once, in his career to that point, been offered to him without a price attached. Meeting the Mentorif. There was a way through that weight. It wasn't going to come from a rousing speech. It came instead from two men who understood him without needing him to explain himself. Sabella's tactical setup for the tournament had tried to bridge the gap between the myth Argentina wanted and the player Messi actually was, building a team that offered Messi passing lanes rather than demanding solo heroics. It was a quiet, structural kind of guidance, a coach reshaping an entire system around protecting the one player who could least afford to be exposed. But the expectation in the stands, and in the newspapers, and in the millions of households watching had not caught up to the tactical reality. They wanted the ball at his feet in the final third, alone, defenders around him, a moment of individual transcendence that would echo 1986. What the team actually needed from him was subtler: link play, patience, the discipline to wait for gaps rather than force them. He understood this distinction with total clarity. It is doubtful that the majority of his own supporters understood this distinction. That gap between what he was asked to embody and what the game actually required of him was its own private exhaustion, one he could never fully explain without sounding as though he were making excuses. And then there was Agüero. Agüero wasn't just a teammate, he was a silent anchor, a mirror reflecting an understanding that few others possessed. In a world demanding noise, Agüero was the quiet affirmation Messi needed. Agüero has spoken in interviews given long after their playing careers. about a private closeness between them that rarely made it into public view. Quiet dinners, a shared understanding forged from being outsiders, together in a football culture that often mistook loudness for passion. He has described Messi in these pre-match hours as a man who withdraws not out of coldness, but out of necessity, as if conversation itself were a form of leakage, a place where nerve and fear could seep out if the mouth stayed open too long. Neither man handed Messi a solution. What they gave him was something closer to permission, a coach willing to build a system around his silence instead of demanding he perform past it, and a friend willing to sit inside that silence with him instead of trying to talk him out of it. Crossing the threshold, the dressing room at the Maracanã before a World Cup final, does not resemble the dressing rooms of ordinary football. It is smaller than the stadium suggests it should be, tiled in a way that makes every sound, a stud against ceramic, a zipper, a cleared throat, travel further than it has any right to. Outside, security personnel move in choreographed patterns. Inside, 30 minutes before the players are due to line the tunnel, there is a strange, suspended quality to time, as though the room itself understands that whatever happens in the next 2 hours will be replayed, dissected, and mythologized for the rest of the century. That afternoon, teammates seeking Messi's gaze found only a vast inner distance. While he often withdrew before big games, those closest felt this day carried a deeper, more profound silence. The captain's armband sat folded on the bench beside him for a long while before he put it on, as though even that small motion required a decision he wasn't ready to make. He laced his boots slowly. He retied them once, though nothing about the first attempt had been wrong. He stared, for stretches of several minutes at a time, at a fixed point on the tiled floor, not blankly, not vacantly, but with the specific intensity of a man running simulations behind his eyes. The German back line, the space between their center backs, when they stepped forward to press, the particular angle at which Manuel Neuer liked to position himself off his line, a habit Messi had studied on tape, until it had become instinct rather than information. Argentina craved fire, a hero who bled passion. Instead, they saw a man whose coping was a total retreat, often mistaken for indifference. Yet, it was the opposite. He cared too profoundly to reveal his vulnerability. Displaying it would have meant admitting how fragile the entire structure was, how much a single mistimed touch could cost him in a country that had already, for years, been keeping score against him. There is a detail that several people close to the national team setup have recounted from that day, though it never made it into any broadcast. At one point, roughly 20 minutes before the players were due to leave the dressing room, assistant coaches began their final tactical reminders, raising their voices slightly to be heard over the ambient roar bleeding in from the stadium above. Messi did not appear to register most of it. He nodded at the appropriate intervals. The way a man nods through a conversation he is only half attending because some other, louder conversation is happening inside his own skull. Alejandro Sabella, the coach who had built this team around protecting and enabling him, is said to have made a point of not approaching him directly in these final minutes, an unspoken agreement between them, built over 2 years of tournaments and qualifiers, that Messi needed to be left inside his own silence until the exact moment the walk to the tunnel began. What was he thinking about In that silence, no one can say with certainty. Messi himself has never given a detailed, public account of his interior state in those specific minutes, true to the same instinct for privacy that built the silence in the first place. But those who have studied him closely, who have watched the pattern repeat itself across 100 must-win matches, describe something consistent. Not fear of losing exactly, but fear of what losing would confirm. There is a story, corroborated by more than one account from within the camp, that in the final minute, before the team was called to line up, Messi looked up, not at any teammate specifically, but at the room as a whole, at the collective mass of men who were about to walk out beside him, and simply exhaled. A long breath released through pursed lips, the kind of exhale that precedes something a person has been holding far longer than the length of the breath itself would suggest. Then he stood, adjusted the captain's armband on his bicep, and became, in the space of that single motion, a different version of himself. Still quiet, but no longer withdrawn. Present, ready to walk into the noise, rather than hide from it. This is the turning point that matters. Not a tactical adjustment, not a team talk, not a moment of individual brilliance on the pitch, but the internal shift from a man protecting himself from the weight of a nation's expectation to a man choosing, deliberately, to carry it anyway, out through the tunnel and into the white noise of the Maracanã. Tests, allies, and enemies once. Through that tunnel, the test was no longer just internal. Germany's system, their pressing triangles, their discipline in transition, became the visible, external form of everything he had been carrying. A defense built to deny him exactly the kind of space his genius depended on. Every doubter who had ever suggested he wasn't truly Argentine enough, wasn't truly made of the same stuff as Diego, was, in this moment, sitting somewhere in that stadium or in front of a television, waiting to be either humbled or vindicated by what he did in the next 2 hours. His allies were on the pitch beside him, a team that Sabella had shaped to share the load rather than hand it entirely to one man. But the ledger of doubt traveled with him too, an enemy that never wore a jersey. The pundits, Argentine and foreign alike, who had spent the tournament framing every match as an audition, a referendum on whether he could finally do, alone, what Maradona had done in 1986. Approach to the inmost cave, the tests of the match itself, the runs into the German half, the half chances, the 90 minutes bleeding into extra time, were the visible surface of a much older test. Whether the quiet, methodical genius he had built over a lifetime could survive contact with a moment that demanded, in the eyes of an entire country, something closer to myth. Every save Neuer made, every gap Germany's backline refused to give him, tightened the same rope that had already been pulling at him since that afternoon in the dressing room. Ordeal the match itself would end, 90 minutes, and then 30 more of extra time later, in a way that the silence had almost seemed to anticipate. A single goal from Mario Götze in the 113th minute, a save Messi couldn't produce, a free header, wide in the second half, that would replay in Argentine memory for years as the moment that got away. Reward Messi would be named Player of the Tournament that evening, an award that felt, in the raw wound of the immediate aftermath, less like an honor and more like a consolation prize handed to a man who had wanted only one specific thing. The golden ball was a hollow echo, a reminder not of triumph, but of the singular burning desire for the trophy he refused to meet with his gaze. This was no reward. It was a promise of unfinished business. He walked past the World Cup trophy without looking at it as he collected the individual award, a detail captured by cameras and endlessly replayed, interpreted by commentators in real time as anguish, as a man unable to look at what he had almost held. It was the loudest thing his silence ever said. The road back there is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something you never had, but from coming close enough to touch it and then watching it recede exactly out of reach. He left Maracanã not with a crown, but with the hollow ache of what could have been. The flight home was a journey through a summer stolen, the weight of an entire nation's disappointment heavy on his silent shoulders, a summer that should have been a coronation, and instead became another data point in the ledger. His country had never stopped. Keeping their resurrection silence, it became clear, was not merely where fear resided. It was the silent forge, where resolve was hammered, patiently, unobserved, through the crucible of years. The same quiet that filled that dressing room in 2014 would return in other dressing rooms, in other tournaments. The 2015 Copa America final, lost on penalties. The 2016 final, lost the same way. The retirement announcement that followed it. The walking back of that retirement. The long, unglamorous rebuilding of a relationship between a man and a country that had never quite decided whether he was theirs. It would take 8 more years, years of aging, of injuries, of a move to Paris that never fully felt like home, of watching younger players inherit stages he had once occupied, before that same silence would find its resolution in a different stadium, under different lights, in Qatar in December of 2022. Return with the elixir, and when it finally happened, when Argentina finally won, the image the world remembers is not a quiet man in a locker room. It is Messi in tears, held aloft by teammates, finally, visibly, uncontrollably emotional in front of the entire planet. But that image only means what it means. Because of this one, the boy grown into a man, sitting with his elbows on his knees in a Maracanã dressing room, staring at a fixed point on the floor, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. That 8 years of silence hadn't already said for him. The tears in Qatar were not the opposite of that silence. They were its final release. The sound a door makes when it finally opens after being held shut by force of will alone for the better part of a decade. Greatness, in Messi's case, was never a performance for the cameras. It was built entirely in the rooms the cameras never entered, in the silences before storms, in the exhale before the exit, in a man choosing, again and again, over years that asked more of him than they had any right to walk back out into the noise anyway. This is the true chronicle of a legend, forged not in fanfare, but in the profound, unwavering power of silence. This is the enduring truth that reshapes what it means to be a hero.